It's finally time for the child seat video so many of you have been asking for. Because today, not only do I have the new Toyota Grand Highlander, we also have some new child seats because a lot of folks were asking for more variation in these videos. So here behind the driver's seat, we have a Kleck rear-facing infant seat. This one has the removable base. It also has the all-important fixed latch anchors. They're not the webby ones, so those can present an installation challenge in some vehicles, and then it has the anti-rebound bar up front. I also have the other tricky seat that a lot of folks have been asking about. This is an enormous rear-facing convertible seat, so you can use this forward-facing or rear-facing. This is a Kiko seat. It is enormous because it has a rating capacity of up to 65 pounds and over 40 inches tall. So the average 5-year-old should fit in this seat, rear-facing still. You could theoretically also be inside the rear-facing OK window up to maybe a kid of about 6 years old, according to some studies. So the American Association of Pediatricians is now recommending that kids sit rear-facing for as long as possible, and that as long as possible will depend on the design of the car seat and, of course, your kid's ability to cross their legs back there when they're riding in it. So first things first, let's adjust the driver's seats. That way I'm still comfortable. I'm 6 feet tall. I still have a reasonable amount of room between my legs and the dashboard. I am sitting in a slightly more upright position than maybe I normally would, but this should give us extra room for the child seat in the back. Let's go ahead and take a look. And yep, back here you can see that even with this relatively large rear-facing infant seat, there is a reasonable amount of room there, and definitely enough room that you could still lock and unlock the seat in its carrier. Getting into the third row, though, that would still be pretty difficult because obviously you aren't going to be able to recline the second row seat. It's just not going to work with that child seat latch anchored into position. And because seats like this have the anti-rebound bar there up front, you're not really going to be able to move the seat forward and backward with that forward-backward lever. It's just not really going to move if it's installed properly. And that's why if we come around to the other side of the Grand Highlander, I have this other seat in the third row, because if you had two rear-facing seats, which you could very logically end up with in the latest rules, if you have a kid that was maybe 4 and one that was an infant, you would have a situation where you'd have troubles getting into the third row. Keep in mind that even when your child goes forward-facing, you can't leave a child seat latch anchored into place in these seats and still tilt and slide the seat forward because of the way that this seat moves right there. You could, however, just pull this little lever right here, slide the seat all the way forward. You can do that when a child seat is latch anchored into place as well. And then actually an adult could get back here into the third row fairly easily. Now, with this seat in this position, you can see that this 3-person bench, even though this is one of the wider benches available in the segment, is completely occupied by that child seat. So this would be pretty tricky to still put a few extra people in the cabin. You're really just limited to the one side of this third row bench. However, the bench in the back of the Grand Highlander is definitely above average size-wise. It is wider than the one that we find in the Honda Pilot, so you are going to have a bit more room back here than in that Honda, and you're better going to be able to put an adult to one side of the child seat. And that's where the Grand Highlander's adult-sized third row becomes a bit more important. You can see at 6 feet tall, I have maybe about ½ an inch of headroom left, and my knees aren't exactly completely in my chest. There is a little bit of room between this seat that has the forward-facing child seat still installed in it. I can still sit back here relatively comfortable. There's a place for my feet to go, and I can still have access to the child in the rear-facing seat. So this setup actually makes sense for families that maybe want to position someone in the third row to help make sure that the child is occupied or at least properly buckled in back here. And then it would still give you that second row seat that you could use for someone else. Bear in mind that we are looking at the model today with the captain's chairs, so there's no middle seat here in the second row. That's probably how I would advise going. We do have top tether anchors for all seat positions. They're behind this little bit of fabric right there in the second and third row seats. You'll find one for each of the seating positions in the middle row, and then back here in the third row, only the passenger side and the middle seat will have top tether anchors. The outboard passenger seat, this is the only one that has latch anchors. The latch anchor design is a little bit different in the second row and the third row. You can see here in the second that the latch anchor is actually a little bit more visible. That really makes it easy to target your clip and get it easily on and off. Although, by the way, I really love this particular style of clip. This is so much easier than some of those older latch anchors as far as getting on and off the vehicle. Now, if I move that out of the way, you'll notice that back here in the third row, the latch anchors are a little bit more hidden behind those little fabric sections. That makes it a little bit more difficult to fish around, but it's still pretty easy to get in and out. One last thing to contemplate is that if you do plan on putting a child seat here in the middle of the third row, we only have a ceiling mounted shoulder belt. And if you do put any of those wider seats in the middle, you might not be able to use the outboard seats. If you get a Grand Highlander with the bench seat in the middle, it might be a little bit easier to put 2 child seats on the 60% folding side and still leave the 40% side for getting into the rear. But keep in mind that some of these much larger child seats, especially like this rear-facing one right in front of me, this is wide enough that it might make that tricky even with the bench seat option in the Grand Highlander. So definitely keep that in mind. If this situation describes you, I would recommend taking your child seats or the ones you intend to have in the new vehicle, take them with you to the dealer as you're taking a look at the vehicle. But because the Grand Highlander has the most legroom combined in its category, you can actually fit a 6-foot or a slightly taller than 6-foot person right up here in the front passenger seat. You'll actually notice this front passenger seat is slightly further forward than the driver's seat. And yes, you can indeed still put these seats in the second row, and then I could even fit back there in the third row behind that infant seat right there behind the driver's seat. So the Grand Highlander is one of the very few vehicles in this segment that has enough room to combine 4 adults, 2 children in rear-facing restraints right here in the second row, as long as they don't mind climbing over things to try and get back there into the way back. If you've made it this far in the video, thanks for watching, and be sure and check out the related content on the Grand Highlander and of course other child seat videos, because we're going to be stuffing these seats into every vehicle that we drive in 2024 for sure, especially family-focused models like this Grand Highlander. And if you're taking a look for one of the most capable and one of the most family-friendly 3-row SUVs available in America, you should definitely put the Grand Highlander on your shopping list, and you should definitely put it on that list ahead of the smaller options. I think this does a better job when it comes to rear-facing seats like this than the new Honda Pilot, definitely ahead of vehicles like the Sorento, the regular Highlander, etc. And even some of the surprisingly large options like a Mazda CX-90, there's less room going on in those vehicles for these rear-facing seats. Part of it is because 3-row vehicles aren't quite as big as they used to be, especially back here in the third row. And the other big part of it is that child seats like this Kiko have just grown enormously over the last few years. Just check this out. It is a fantastically huge seat, and it is by no means an outlier. As rear-facing recommendations have really ratcheted up, the rear-facing child seats have become bigger and bigger and bigger, not to mention booster seats with cup holders galore, etc. So be sure and let me know what you think about that down there in the comments section below. And how have you managed to arrange your seats in your Grand Highlander if you have one? Or did you simply decide to go to the better route, I would say, which would be something like a minivan? If you had a Sienna or an Odyssey or a Pacifica, clearly these seats would fit in there even more easily than they do in the Grand Highlander. See all of you next week.